Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today on this webinar. We'll be talking about the projects in Africa. Before we start actually on that subject, quick information on the next webinar. Places and subjects have been already settled. So it will be same time on the 9th of July. And we'll be treating about the independent operator subject. We know that's a subject that raises a lot of questions when we meet you. So we'll have a dedicated webinar on that subject. You will receive the link to access that webinar, and you will also receive the slides of this webinar. So don't bother doing any screenshots. You will have all the material with you. Moving now to the agenda, we'll start with some basic information on Project Smart Explorer, and then we will have rather a classic approach on the agenda where we'll have a funnel approach. Jean will start to give us some market news on the continent, and then some focus on some areas, and then we will look at the projects actually in Africa with the tips. What are the type of our projects? Who are the key players, and so on. And we'll end up by the first vision of the future over there. If you have any question, don't hesitate to ask them in the chat. We will just address them at the end of our presentation. We have a dedicated time for that. We can skip, I think, the faces of To Be First Consulting. That's the three faces that you can see, same people behind us, behind the company. Regarding the customers, we are growing again since the last webinar. Barclays just joined us, so welcome to them if they are on the meeting. Now, just a quick information on Project Smart Explorer and what's coming on in the future. As usual, we track projects, so from the very beginning, and we qualify them. We track oil and gas and petrochemical, this is being our historical core business. Now, since 5 years, we also track all the energy transition application. And following a demand coming from most of you, the will to have mining. So we are currently working in having the mining projects with the same approach that we did so far with the other families of energy. And we target to have this project, let's say, by the end of the summer. Now, I think we can move with the heart of today. Jean, I'll let you the floor to start maybe with the market news of what's happening in the continent.
Thank you, Jack, and thank you for this introduction. Indeed, we are working tirelessly to improve our tool, and following your supposition and comments, we decided to add the mining that we were looking into it. If you have some question at the end, do not hesitate to ask us. So going to African topic now, the idea was to start really from the big picture, what is external and going to impact project, especially linked to Africa. And Africa is kind of a growing population, as you might know. It has been, I would say, the case for the last few decades already. And here I wanted to really put some figures behind, because it's quite interesting to say, hey, of course the population is growing, but how much does it drive the business? And here on the graph, you can see the volume of population, which is projected to happen on the next 25 and 50 years in Africa. And you see Africa being splitted between Northern Africa, which is population is growing, should double and arrive to, I would say, 1 billion people. But Sub-Saharan Africa is going to pass from 1 billion people to almost 4 billion people. And here, of course, it's quite a game changer, because as you may remember from previous presentation or workshop we do together, demography is a huge driver for energy demand. It's a driver for two things. First, for economical growth, but also for human progress. And while the economical growth of Africa is still slow and going slower than any other region, the human progress is going quite sharper in Africa. And there is one figure that I wanted to share with you to enlighten how much this demography is going to have impact into oil and gas. It's a figure from the United Nations that estimate that you need about 9 barrels of oil equivalent per person per year to have human progress and human development. So 9 barrels on average all along the year. And today, the level of Africa is a third of that. It's just above 3.2 billion barrel of oil equivalent, and the rest of the world is at 13 barrel of oil equivalent. Which means that here, just by human progress and the research of this progress for the population in Africa, the consumption of each African is going to be multiplied in the next decade by 3. And on top of that, you are going to grow the number of people. So you can imagine how much is going to drive the demand for energy just by the African continent. So that's why by itself, it's already an important topic to have in mind. The population has been growing massively in Asia Pacific on the last few decades. It tends to slow down now, and this growth in population is now going to the continent of Africa, and we have to bear that in mind. After this demographic step up, of course, what is interesting to look is the African energy demand, because we are, I would say, into a situation where today Africa is producing energy for itself, but also mostly for export. And you are going to see the project we are going to talk about in the rest of the presentation are mostly going to drive exportation need of energy. But in the next few decades, Africa will pass from the situation where they are net exporter of energy to the primary users of their own energy. And here it's quite a game changer, because if you combine both graphs, here you have the total energy demand on the bottom left, and you see that Africa will today have a demand of about 4.6 billion of barrel oil equivalent. In 2050, it will be 12 billion barrel of oil equivalent per year for this year. And in 2053, it will be 20 billion. And you see here the volume of energy production in Africa, where today it produces a bit more than what it needs. In 2050, we start to arrive to this crossover, and in 2060 you end up with a situation where Africa is asking for 5 billion more of oil barrel than what is able to produce. So you are totally in this situation where the projects which are going to happen today in Africa for, I would say, maybe the next 20 years will serve for exportation, and then will not even be able to cover the production and the consumption mostly of the African continent. So it's quite interesting to see the long-term also effect, and that operators, what operators have in mind. Today they are developing projects for the export of energy, but later on those same projects will serve the internal demand of the African energy. So it's quite interesting to see, and you see in the split of energy, even if renewable is starting to take off, I would say starting 2050, let's say, so really late compared to other countries, you see that gas is really being the main driver, with oil still having a lion's share in the market. Now, what is happening in Africa is that we see a lot of game changers, to be honest, and we wanted to take the example of Namibia, because Namibia is a country which has not been, I would say, on the map of the energy market. Nothing was really happening there regarding projects. And just by, I would say, summertime, Total Energy arrived with a giant discovery. Maybe you heard of it, I'm quite sure. It's called the Venus field, which is just at the, I would say, border between Namibia and South Africa. And here, 300 kilometers from the sea, Total Energy made one of the biggest discovery that has ever been made, to the point that it's really hard to estimate the volume and the size of this discovery, but the field is of great quality. There is also a lot of gas in this field, and the first estimation are saying, and which are quite conservative, are saying that this field is minimum 150 kilometers long. Okay, so you can imagine the size, and has on the minimum more than 5 billion barrels of oil that could be recovered inside it. So you can imagine the size of the discovery, and that's why we see projects going back to Africa, because there is those giant discoveries to be made, and those high quality oil that can be produced. And of course, at this scale, even if the project needs to be massive and needs to be deep offshore or ultra deep offshore, in the case of Venus, it still become profitable. So it's also a game changer for companies like Total Energy, because as you might know, Total Energy was really busy on the other side of Africa in Mozambique, trying to develop an LNG project. but you can't do everything in the meantime. So even in the portfolio of Total Energy, having this discovery is also a kind of a game changer, because it might make the arbitrage to say, okay, let's focus on Namibia first and maybe do Mozambique later. And that's what is happening also in Africa. All the countries and all the regions are a little bit in competition for their own project. But what's clear is that the world is asking for this energy to be produced. If not the world, even Africa is asking for it. So now, what is quite important is to look at the evolution of Africa on, I would say, the global map. And here there is one important figure we wanted to share with you, because as Jack mentioned, we have been tracing oil and gas and petrochem for quite a long time now, and for more than 10 years. And we wanted to check on the period of 10 years, what was the spot of Africa on the market. So we decided to calculate globally what was the market share of African projects every year, starting in 2016 when it was only 9% of the market, to steady growth from 2016 to 2019, where Africa was representing about 40% of the market, and then COVID happened. And what COVID happened, of course, all the projects which were, I would say, ultra deep or complex projects, where the break-even was quite questionable, all those projects got cancelled, and Africa suffered a lot from this situation, because many projects got suspended or postponed or delayed forever. And that's how we end up in a situation in 2022 where Africa was only representing 7% of the market. Now back to the situation we are in today, starting 2024, where Africa is back mostly driven, I would say, by the counter effect of the Russian situation, because all the projects that were supposed to happen in Russia and were already in operation in Russia need to be, I would say, somehow compensated or replaced. And the best place to do it was clearly identified to be Africa. And that's why we end up in a situation today where in our forecast, Africa is representing 20% of the market, which is completely massive. I mean, in terms of volume of project, it's bigger than US, or it's bigger than Middle East. So it's no more marginal market anymore, even if Africa has its own problem in delivering projects that might not occur in different regions. You can imagine that from this magnificent potential, a lot of projects will be driven on the market. So when we talk about Africa, it's quite a huge continent, and of course the situation is not the same everywhere. And what we have identified, I would say, the four zones which are, I would say, the more active. Starting by the north, of course, you have a lot of onshore, offshore application going from Algeria to Egypt. This Mediterranean area is really active. Especially Libya is back, I would say, to the market. Egypt is also trying to go back on the market, even if projects have a lot of trouble to be paid, etc. But really an active region, as we can see. We also have the region of the Gulf of Guinea, which is super active. Angola is still quite active on the market. Togo, Ghana, all those regions, especially since they managed to sign or to agree on a pipeline project to go from this Gulf of Guinea to distribute all over and to turn around Africa and to deliver back to Europe the energy. I think it will be really a key project to make sure that the production of oil and gas will still happen in this region. Then going to the other side, going to East Africa, clearly, I would say between Mozambique, Tanzania, and Uganda, you have a lot of projects, especially offshore gas for Mozambique and Tanzania, and mostly onshore oil and gas for Uganda and Kenya, you know, even in this region of those large lakes where a lot of things are happening and a lot of business development is being done. And the last region, but which is starting again, is clearly this region that I mentioned between Namibia and South Africa, where a lot is happening, especially offshore with massive discoveries that could be really kind of a development leading like Buzios, kind of, you know, with a wave of FPSO all over the others, and that could be quite an active zone to be developed. So now, as we say, Africa is quite specific because a lot of things can happen, and the political game has a huge influence in those countries. But there's two things we really wanted to share as alignment on those situations. And the first case was Angola leaving OPEC Plus in December 2023, so 6 months ago, because it was quite reflexive on, I would say, the decision process and what are the key aspects in this production. because Angola was showing more need, I would say, in terms of cash flow to say, okay, we still produce and we try to sell the maximum of our volume because we're interested by the money more than we are interested by, I would say, the protection of our market and the long-term strategy that OPEC Plus was driving, mostly led by Saudi Arabia. So here, it's not, I would say, the only country that has made this remark, but clearly this situation in Africa was not bearable to say, okay, we are going to push our production down. No, the idea of Angola was to say, okay, no, we need a steady and even an increasing stream of cash. So we are going to still produce and still push for a new project on the market. So that's clearly the political goal of the Angola government. Now, as you may know, political government might change quite quickly in Africa, more than other regions. And here we wanted to show the example of Mali. Even if you're French, yeah, I'm sure you have followed this quite closely. But what happened is that in the Sahel region, there were a lot of French influence and French political influence, let's say. And when all this, I would say, influence was starting to be questioned, even if the political landscape was shifting, the company landscape was not changing. And even when the government of Mali changed, the new government arriving made it really clear that they still expected the French companies like Total Energy, but any other, to produce a project, to still run the operation, because the government might change, but the need for the project to develop the economical growth is still there, and government might change, but the need for those projects to run and to produce value is still there. So what we see that in all the region, not only in Mali, but even if the political landscape is changing, the project and the operation are more or less remaining exactly the same. The only, I would say, big problem is that when the Islamic State, and that's a little bit the case of Mozambique, is arriving, of course, it drives everybody around because it does not seem to be a good partner for business, we can understand. And of course, here it puts an hold on all the projects that you can find on the region. That's why Mozambique is still starting slowly. But out of this situation, the rest seems to be workable for all the partners of those projects. So where it was a massive constraint before, it starts to be less and less as a constraint in the future. Going into type of project, because we are talking about project, but as you will see in the rest of the presentation, it changed a lot in terms of region, it changed a lot in terms of type of application. And here, if we look from really the big picture, Africa is clearly still massively interested by oil and gas. Petrochem is, I would say, only happening in countries where, in the north, mostly on the Mediterranean Sea, between Egypt, Libya, and Algeria. And energy transition is still starting slowly, mostly driven today by solar farm. Solar farm having two applications. One is for the local utilities, but not so much. Most of the projects we see of solar farm in Africa are today linked to hydrogen, but the hydrogen brick will be built in the future. So today they concentrate on those solar farm to build up the capacity of green electricity. But it's still a marginal, and you will see in the figures, it's still marginal effect. Most of the focus is clearly on the oil and gas. It should remain like this for quite a long time. But at least you know what you can expect when you go for those business. You can push for new technology, etc. But keep in mind that it still remains mostly driven by oil and gas. Now, if we make the split, it's quite interesting to see in this oil and gas that there is clearly two situations. On top, I put the pipeline for onshore project. And in the pipeline, I would say we have already identified for the next 5 years 50 projects representing a billion of capex of 87 billion US dollar, which is quite massive and give us an average of 1.270 billion per project, meaning the project, when you look at it globally, they are just below usually the billion in average, and meaning the onshore project in Africa are more or less twice the size, a little bit less. And you see that the capex pipeline is going up for 2024, 2025, and then it slows down. If it slows down, it doesn't mean the market is collapsing, just reflect the vision we have of project on those years. But it's quite interesting to see that the pipeline is quite heavy. You see quite a big boom with projects which are twice the size of any other place on the planet. Now going to the offshore. The offshore, it's a complete different game because we have way less projects, only 37, but in terms of capex, it's twice bigger. And here it means that the projects are quite giant, on average 4 billion, especially if we look at the region of Tanzania and Mozambique. Here we are talking about 10 billion, sometimes 20 billion per project. So it's completely crazy size. It's a project that we were seeing, I would say, more than 10 years ago in Australia, for example, or in Saudi, that is nowhere done like this anymore. But in Africa, as the fields are quite massive, if you really want to break even, you need to go with those big boys development to produce a lot of volume. And that's what we see, especially on FPSO. And that's why you have this pipeline of project, which was going down during COVID, now back to normality with expectations which are completely crazy, with a pipeline of business which is massive. And here there is no other place on the planet and no other scope of as the African offshore where you can find such a profile. You have maybe a comparative which would be the LNG in US, but you can imagine, I mean, the wave of interest which is driving through those projects. Even if half is not happening, it still means that you have 80 billion happening in the next 5 years in Africa, sorry. So it's completely massive. Now, if we look at the two other scope, you see that Petrochem, which was quite shy already before COVID, is starting up slowly, but especially in the north of Africa. And here the ticket for Petrochem are quite small, to be honest. It's not an amazing revolution, but it still follow a normal path without increase like we can see on other regions of the planet. And what is quite interesting is to see that those projects are mostly driven by demography effect. Where you have population growing, you have petrochem project, because most of those projects are to distribute energy or I would say plastic or polymer to their own population. The last part is energy transition. And here energy transition, as we say, is taking off slower than any other region on the planet, but still we see some opportunities happening there in really key region, not everywhere in the continent, but still it average 31 projects with a 2.3 billion average, which is quite well, but not to the crazy side that we may start to anticipate in Europe or in US. So it's not there yet, but it's happening slowly and slowly in Africa for energy transition and for petrochem. Now, passing the end to Jack, and I will talk to you about the key players of the African continent.
Thanks, Jean. Let's start by putting actually a number behind the feeling. If we look at the operators, almost half of the market is being done by international oil company. Just to give a magnitude behind that, that's almost twice the size of their market share in the rest of the world. So they really have their private garden in Africa, and this can be explained by three things. And these three things, two of them has been touched base by Jean already. The first one is the complexity, the technical complexity of these projects. When we talk about deep offshore application, this is where the know-how is. The second one, Jean also mentioned that, is the project size and the financials that are being needed to fund these projects. That's also playing in their favor. And the last element, the last layer, that also is a plus for international oil companies, is the risk level. We know that the projects in Africa comes with a part of risk, both being politically, technically, or timing-wise. So that's also a know-how that they have in the national oil companies. On top of that, there is still the will to have a more financial fallout in the area. So it's always been the case, but now it's getting more and more the standard to have local contents for all the projects in Africa. The last thing that is, let's say, coming from an historical market from the Europeans, all the electrical standards and mechanical standards are mostly done from Europe, or being from copy-paste from Europe, and that is still the case. So Europe used to drive projects in Africa, and it's still the same currently. We see that basically half of the FEED and the EPC are being designed in Europe. And the Chinese, even if they are being more and more present in Africa, the rise is still very slow and nothing compared to some other industries that we especially have in Africa. I'm thinking about the mining that we will include by the end of the summer. So hopefully we will soon have the numbers to express that feeling. But the Chinese are not yet on the oil and gas as strong as they are on other fields. But in parallel, what we do see is an increase of Africa to have their own engineering capacity. And they do that by, let's say, two ways of doing that. Either half of that is coming from, let's say, local offices of Western contractors, and the other half is actually local companies that are being created in Africa. Now, if we move to the project outlook and try to see how the capex is evolving through the years, the first thing is that let's say we can see two waves of investment. The first step, we just crossed was, let's say, 22, 23. So out of the COVID with a bit of delay always, and that was a major step that has been crossed. The second step is coming now. It's more a floor than a step when you see as big as they are. And when we see where it's coming from, yes, there is energy transition that is being created, but that does not explain the push. The push comes mostly from oil and gas. You can see on the graph, the evolution or let's say the part of petrochem remains standard from 2020 to 2025, but the increase of the oil and gas demand is actually going up. Also, as Jean said in the beginning, the war in Ukraine also was a catalyst for this increase. Now, the problem, or let's say the particularity that we have in Africa, is always a discrepancy between the forecast and what is actually happening. And if we look at the opportunities for ball valve, which represent quite a bit the mechanical equipment needs, this reflects actually this discrepancy. If we look at the forecast, the market demands an increase of ball valves going from 1 to 7 in a span of 3 years. That will, of course, not happen. And the main reason is that Africa is not the only one in need for mechanical equipment. All the planet, and we saw that in your workshop and in previous webinars, all the world is asking for more and more projects, and the actors remain the same. So that push from Africa would not be able to be materialized. But if we look still at what happened, especially last year, and what we have currently in portfolio, we see that last year was already twice the amount of what we used to know before in terms of EPC being awarded on ball valves. When we look at today, we are supposed to double versus last year. That will not happen. We see that already. We are, let's say, 40% of what we achieved last year. So most probably we will end up at the performance of 2023. And but what is very interesting is already the level of EPC being awarded for the following year. So for 25, that is quite good. So yes, there is still a discrepancy between the market need and the reality, but still we entered a new era in terms of level of business in Africa, with this step being now since 2023. The last information that we wanted to share with you before Jean moves to the conclusion, and then we take a bit of time to have a Q&A session. It's the two phases that we have in Africa in terms of geography and applications. Basically, you have a geographical limit, which is the Sahara. Above that limit, so all the Mediterranean countries, this is where you will have all the petrochemical complexes, and this is also where energy transition on its level it's happening. As Jean said, mainly solar farms, but this is also where you will have the desalination projects, especially that we can find in Egypt. On the opposite, if you go south to the Sahara, the picture is completely different, and petrochem and energy transition comes basically disappeared from the picture, and this is where you have all the big oil and gas projects that we've been talking about, and this is what is actually driving mostly the business up in Africa. Jean, I'll let you complete with some additional information if you want, and then move to a conclusion before the Q&A.
Thank you, Jack. No, I think you said most of it. But going to a conclusion, and there's many points to keep in mind for Africa. But the first point that is driving clearly, and it's one of the key regions driving the growth into project. The growth is coming from 3 points. First is a global demand for energy, which is completely exploding in electricity, in petrochem, in raw energy. And Africa is one of the good place to produce this big volume of project and to find fields which have not been, I would say, discovered yet. The second point, which is driving the business in Africa, is local demand. If not today, everybody knows whatever happened, that the local demand for energy will grow massively into 2 decades in Africa. And of course, you need to build up the project today to be able to answer this energy demand tomorrow. And clearly, that's the second wave of interest, which is driving business in Africa. And the second part, which has been, I would say, the cherry on the cake for Africa, which has suffered a lot during COVID, was the situation with the Ukraine war. Because, I mean, if you look what happened where Russia was shifting its supply back from the west to eastern countries, it means that all the Western countries needed to replace the supply of energy, of gas, and of oil. And when you look at the volume of production of Russia, it's not something you can compensate or replace with small PCs, with a small revamp onshore, offshore in the North Sea. You need to go for big boys, and those big boys projects were in the box and were already in the pipe, or the feed were already done in Africa. So that's why Africa, when came back on the first stage really quickly, is because all the projects already up and running in Russia were needed to be replaced. And also on the long term, all the projects that were supposed to happen in Russia needed to be replaced as well. So that's why it was really a triple effect for Africa to pass from market share of 7% back to 20% with more interest than Middle East or to America. So clearly, Africa offers huge opportunities on the coming years, more than it was, I would say, on the last 3-4 years. It's back, and we see it when you go to exhibition or if you go to any conference. You can see that a lot of people are talking and opening offices in this region. And here it's mostly led by IOCs. Clearly, it remained there, I would say, private garden because of the technological know-how. Clearly, we are talking a lot about a deep offshore application, and here it's not something that is mastered by a lot of companies. There is, I would say, 5-6 companies which are able technically to do it, but there is also I would say a problem of project management, which is financial capabilities to take risks, to follow on those projects. Something that IOC, on the example of Total Energy, is quite comfortable to do, to take some risk and to follow up on the political landscape and to have the connection to develop project there, which independent companies might not have or might have to go and might not be familiar and comfortable in doing. But clearly, IOCs have been doing it for, I would say, decades, if not their entire history, to develop this project. So that's why they are really strong, and they develop for their own 45% of the market in Africa. And if we take all the joint ventures, they develop more or less 70% of the project in Africa. So meaning they are everywhere. Now the problem that the local government are expected more and more condition and more in-country value. So it's really a game between those government and the IOCs to find, I would say, the more profitable condition for everybody to develop this project. And here it's a little bit a poker game between the government that needs the cash flow of this energy and the IOCs that want to develop the project as fast as they can and don't want to be delayed. So that's why we see some final investment decisions which were supposed to be taken to be delayed forever. And at the opposite, a new region like Namibia popping up like nowhere, and where Total want to accelerate and develop the first project in 2 years' time. So it's clearly a poker game between all the IOCs and those countries to make sure in the portfolio that the best projects are developed, and for the government to attract the companies to do projects. So sometimes you see the national companies which are kind of trying to look and to shine, to attract the companies and to attract the investors more than at the end organize the projects themselves, because they might not have the technical know-how to manage those projects. No, Africa, even if it's a continent of opportunities, clearly, still remain under a massive threat, especially the Islamic State, which is operating in the Sahel region, but also in the region of Mozambique. It seems to be under control of the African Forces Union. For the time being, but of course, when you're an operator and you are going to put billion on the table, you might feel a little bit shy of just being under control, because of course you have the long-term perspective of your investment, and it's hard to imagine the long-term perspective of the situation. And gives credit for offshore projects, because when you have an FPSO 300 kilometers from the shore, of course, you are less exposed to this kind of risk. And the second threat is the Chinese contractor. As Jack mentioned, they've made a massive strategical push on all the mining operation of Africa, and we still do not see them very much into oil and gas. I would say without taking too much risk, they might start to jump more and more into those projects. And the question is, of course, as soon as they will start to enter this market, they will go as a contractor at the EPC stage, meaning that for you will have to be at the FEED stage to make sure that you are qualified and you are imposed in the vendor list to get the order. The good part of this is that all the FEED and most of the EPC, as Jack mentioned, are being made by European offices of and Western contractors. So it still gives US and European OEM the advantage to jump on those projects. And the idea is, okay, which region to go after, which project to go after to take the minimum risk. Also because Africa is a massive continent, so you can't be everywhere, especially at the size of those projects. So you need to find the good opportunities for you to go on those projects.